Into the ship.
In the changing room, in Cylinder A, Norman stepped into his suit. Tina and Edmonds helped fit the helmet over his head, and Snap blocked the ring at his neck. He felt the heavy weights of the rebreather tank on his back, the straps pressed into his shoulders. He tasted metallic air. There was a crackle as his helmet intercom came on. The first words he heard were, "What about at the threshold of a great opportunity for the human species?" Norman laughed, grateful for the break in the tension. "You find it funny?" Ted asked, offended. Norman looked across the room at the suited man with "Fielding" stenciled on his yellow helmet. "No," Norman said. "I'm just nervous." "Me too," Beth said. "Nothing to it," Barnes said. "Trust me." "What are the 3 biggest lies in DH8? Harry said, and they laughed again. They crowded together into the tiny airlock, bumping helmeted heads, and the bulkhead hatch to the left was sealed, the wheels spinning. Barnes said, "Okay, folks, just breathe easy." He opened the lower hatch, exposing black water. The water did not rise into the compartment. "The habitat's on positive pressure," Barnes said. "The level won't come up. Now, watch me and do this the way I do. You don't want to tear your suit." Moving awkwardly with the weight of the tanks, he crouched down by the hatch, gripped the side handholds, and let go, disappearing with a soft splash. One by one, they dropped down to the floor of the ocean. Norman gasped as near-freezing water enveloped his suit. Immediately, he heard the hum of a tiny fan as the electrical heaters in his suit activated. His feet touched soft, muddy ground. He looked around in the darkness. He was standing beneath the habitat. Directly ahead, 100 yards away, was a glowing rectangular grid. Barnes was already strutting forward, leaning into the current, moving slowly like a man on the moon. "Isn't this fantastic?" "Calm down, Ted," Harry said. Beth said, "Actually, it's odd how little life there is down here. Have you noticed? Not a sea fan, not a slug, not a sponge, not a solitary fish. Nothing but empty brown seafloor. This must be one of those dead spots in the Pacific." A bright light came on behind him. Norman's own shadow was cast forward on the bottom. He looked back and saw Edmonds holding a camera and light in a bulky waterproof housing. "We recording all this?" "Yes, sir." "Try not to fall down, Norman." Beth laughed. "I'm trying." They were closer now to the grid. Norman felt better seeing the other divers working there. To the right was the high fin, extending out of the coral, an enormous, smooth, dark surface, dwarfing them as it rose towards the surface. Barnes led them past the fin and down into a tunnel cut in the coral. The tunnel was 60 feet long, narrow, strung with lights. They walked single file. It felt like going down into a mine, Norman thought. "This is what the divers cut?" "That's right." Norman saw a boxy, corrugated steel structure surrounded by pressure tanks. "Airlock ahead. We're almost there," Barnes said. "Everybody okay?" "So far," Harry said. They entered the airlock, and Barnes closed the door. Air hissed loudly. Norman watched the water recede, down past his faceplate, then his waist, his knees, then to the floor. The hissing stopped, and they passed through another door, sealing it behind them. Norman turned to the metal hull of the spacecraft. The robot had been moved aside. Norman felt very much as if he were standing alongside a big jetliner. A curved metal structure and a flush door. The metal was a dull gray, which gave it an ominous quality. Despite himself, Norman was nervous. Listening to the way the others were breathing, he sensed they were nervous too. "Okay," Barnes said. "Everybody here?" Edmund said, "Wait for the video, please, sir." "Okay, waiting." They all lined up beside the door, but they still had their helmets on. It wasn't going to be much of a picture, Norman thought. Edmund said, "Tape is running." Ted said, "I'd like to say a few words." Harry, "Jesus, Ted, can't you ever lit up?" Ted, "I think it's important." Harry, "Go ahead and make your speech." Ted, "Hello. This is Ted Fielding, here at the door of the unknown spacecraft, which has been discovered..." Barnes. Wait a minute, Ted. Here at the door of the unknown spacecraft sounds a lot like here at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Ted. You don't like it? Barnes. Well, I think it has the wrong associations. Ted. I thought you would like it. Beth. Can we just get on with it, please? Ted. Never mind. Harry. What are you going to pout about now? Ted. Never mind. We'll do it without any commentary on this historic moment. Harry. Okay, fine. Let's get this thing open. Ted. I think everybody knows how I feel. I think that we should have some brief remarks for posterity. Harry. Well, make your goddamn remarks. Ted. Listen, you son of a bitch. I've had about enough of your superior know-it-all attitude. Barnes. Stop the tape, please. Edmonds. Tape is stopped, sir. Barnes. Let's everyone settle down. Harry. I consider all this ceremony utterly irrelevant. Ted. Well, it's not irrelevant. It's appropriate. Barnes. All right, I'll do it. Roll the tape. Edmonds. Tape is rolling. Barnes. This is Captain Barnes. We are now about to open the hatch cover. Present with me on this historic occasion are Ted Fielding, Norman Johnson, Beth Halpern, and Harry Adams. Harry. Why am I last? Barnes. I did it left to right, Harry. Harry. Isn't it funny the only black man is named last? Barnes. Harry, it's left to right. The way we're standing here. Harry. And after the only woman. I'm a full professor. Beth is only an assistant professor. Beth. Harry. Ted. You know how perhaps we should be identified by our full titles and institutional affiliations. Harry. What's wrong with alphabetical order? Barnes. That's it. Forget it. No tape. Edmonds. Tape is off, sir. Barnes. Jesus Christ. He turned away from the group, shaking his helmeted head. He flipped up the metal plate, exposed the two buttons, and pushed one. A yellow light blinked. Ready. Everybody stay on internal air, Barnes said. They all continued to breathe from their tanks, in case the interior gases in the spacecraft were toxic. Everybody ready? Ready. Barnes pushed the button marked Open. A sign flashed, adjusting atmosphere. Then, with a rumble, the door slid open sideways, just like an airplane door. For a moment, Norman could see nothing but blackness beyond. They moved forward cautiously, shone their lights through the open doors, saw girders, a complex of metal tubes. Check the air, Beth. Beth pulled the plunger on a small gas monitor in her hand. The readout screen glowed. Helium, oxygen, trace CO2, and water vapor. The right proportions. It's pressurized atmosphere. The ship adjusted its own atmosphere? Looks like it. Okay. One at a time. Barnes removed his helmet first. Breathed the air. It seems okay. Metallic. A slight tingle, but okay. He took a few deep breaths, then nodded. The others removed their helmets, set them on the deck. That's better. Shall we go? Why not? There was a brief hesitation, and then Beth stepped through quickly. Ladies first. The others followed her. Norman glanced back, saw all their helmets lying on the floor. Edmonds, holding the video camera to her eyes, said, Go ahead, Dr. Johnson. Norman turned and stepped into the spacecraft.
Interior.
They stood on a catwalk 5 feet wide, suspended high in the air. Norman shone his flashlight down. The beam glowed through 40 feet of darkness before it splashed on the lower hull. Surrounding them, dimly visible in the darkness, was a dense network of struts and girders. Beth said, It's like being in an oil refinery. She shone her light on one steel beam. Stenciled was AVR 09. All the stenciling was in English. Most of what you see is structural, Barnes said. Cross-stress bracing for the outer hull. Gives tremendous support along all axes. The ship is very ruggedly built, as we suspected, designed to take extraordinary stresses. There's probably another hole further in. Norman was reminded that Barnes had once been an aeronautical engineer. Not only that, Harry said, shining his light on the outer hole. Look at this. A layer of lead. Radiation shield? Must be. It's 6 inches thick. So this ship was built to handle a lot of radiation? A hell of a lot, Harry said. There was a haze in the ship and a faint oily feel to the air. The metal girders seemed to be coated in oil, but when Norman touched them, the oil didn't come off on his fingers. He realized that the metal itself had an unusual texture. It was slick and slightly soft to the touch, almost rubbery. Interesting, Ted said. Some kind of new material. We associate strength with hardness, but this metal, if it is metal, is both strong and soft. Materials technology has obviously advanced since our day. Obviously, Harry said. Well, it makes sense, Ted said. If you think of America 50 years ago as compared to today, one of the biggest changes is the great variety of plastics and ceramics we have now that were not even imagined back then. Ted continued to talk, but his voice echoed in the cavernous darkness. But Norman could hear the tension in his voice. Ted's whistling in the dark, he thought. They moved deeper into the ship. Norman felt dizzy to be so high in the gloom. They came to a branch point in the catwalk. It was hard to see with all the pipes and struts, like being in a forest of metal. Which way? Barnes had a wrist compass. It glowed green. Go right. They followed the network of catwalks for 10 minutes more. Gradually, Norman could see that Barnes was right. There was a central cylinder constructed within the outer cylinder, and held away from it by a dense arrangement of girders and supports. A spacecraft within a spacecraft. Why would they build a ship like this? You have to ask them. The reasons must be compelling, Barnes said. The power requirements for a double hull with so much lead shielding. Hard to imagine the engine you'd need to make something this big fly. After 3 or 4 minutes, they arrived at the door on the inner hull. It looked like the outer door. Breathers back on? I don't know. Can we risk it? Without waiting, Beth flipped up the panel of buttons, pressed open, and the door rumbled open. More darkness beyond. They stepped through. Norman felt softness underfoot. He shined his light down on the beige carpeting. Their flashlights crisscrossed the room, revealing a large, contoured beige console with 3 high-backed padded seats. The room was clearly built for human beings. Must be the bridge of the cockpit. But the curved consoles were completely blank. There was no instrumentation of any kind. And the seats were empty. They swung their beams back and forth in the darkness. Looks like a mock-up rather than the real thing. It can't be a mock-up. Well, it looks like one. Norman ran his hand over the smooth contours of the console. It was nicely molded, pleasant to feel. Norman pressed the surface, felt it bend to his touch. Rubbery again. Another new material. Norman's flashlight showed a few artifacts. Taped to the far end of the console was a hand-marked sign on a 3x5 filing card. It said, "Go, baby, go!" Nearby was a small plastic statuette of a cute animal that looked like a purple squirrel. The base said, "Lucky Lemontina," whatever that meant. These seats leather? It looks like it. Where are the damn controls? Norman continued to poke at the blank console, and suddenly the beige console surface took on depth and appeared to contain instruments. All the instrumentation was somehow within the surface of the console, like an optical illusion or a hologram. Norman read the lettering above the instruments. POS thrusters, F3 piston booster, glider, sieves. More new technology, Ted said. Reminiscent of liquid crystals, but far superior. Some kind of advanced optoelectronics. Suddenly, all the console screens glowed red, and there was a beeping sound. Startled, Norman jumped back. The control panel was coming to life. Watch it, everybody! A single bright lightning flash of intense white light filled the room, leaving a harsh afterimage. Oh, God! Another flash, and another, and then the ceiling lights came on, evenly illuminating the room. Norman saw startled, frightened faces. He sighed, exhaling slowly. Jesus! How the hell did that happen? Barnes said. Oh, it was me, Bev said. I pushed this button. Let's not go around pushing buttons, if you don't mind, Barnes said irritably. It was marked room lights. It seemed an appropriate thing to do. Let's just try to stay together on this, Barnes said. Well, Jesus, how? Just don't push any more buttons, Beth. They were moving around the cabin, looking at the instrument panel, at the chairs. All of them, that is, except for Harry. He stood very still in the middle of the room, not moving, and said, Anybody see a date anywhere? No date. There's gotta be a date, Harry said, suddenly tense. And we've gotta find it. Because this is definitely an American spaceship from the future. What's it doing here? Norman asked. Damned if I know, Harry said. He shrugged. Norman frowned. What's wrong, Harry? Nothing. You sure? Yeah. Sure. Norman thought, he's figured out something and it bothers him. But he's not saying what it is. Ted said, So this is what a time travel machine looks like. I don't know, Barnes said. If you ask me, this instrument panel looks like it's for flying, and this room looks like a flight deck. Norman thought so too. Everything about the room reminded him of an airline cockpit. The 3 chairs for pilot, co-pilot, navigator. The layout of the instrumentation. This was a machine that flew. He was sure of it. Yet something was odd. He slipped into one of the contoured chairs. The soft, leather-like material was almost too comfortable. He heard a gurgling. Water inside? I hope you're not going to fly this sucker, Ted laughed. No. What's that whirring noise? The chair gripped him. Norman had an instant of panic, feeling the chair move all around his body, squeezing his shoulders, wrapping around his hips. The leather padding slid around his head, covering his ears, drawing down over his forehead. He was sinking deeper, disappearing inside the chair itself, being swallowed up by it. Oh, God! And then the chair snapped forward, pulling up tight before the control console, and the whirring stopped. Then, nothing. I think, Beth said, that the chair thinks you are going to fly it. Norman said, trying to control his breathing, his racing pulse. I wonder how I get out. The only part of his body still free were his hands. He moved his fingers, felt a panel of buttons on the arm of the chair. He pressed one. The chair slid back, opened like a soft clam, released him. Norman climbed out and looked back at the imprint of his body, slowly disappearing as the chair whirred and adjusted itself. Harry poked one of the leather pads experimentally, hearing the gurgle. Water-filled. Makes perfect sense, Barnes said. Water's not compressible. You can withstand enormous G-forces sitting in a chair like this. And the ship itself is built to take great strains, Ted said. Maybe time travel itself is strenuous? Structurally strenuous? Maybe, Norman was doubtful. But I think Barnes is right. This is a machine that flew. Perhaps it just looked that way, Ted said. After all, we know how to travel in space, but we don't know how to travel in time. We know that space and time are really aspects of the same thing, space-time. Perhaps you're required to fly in time just the way you fly in space. Maybe time travel and space travel are more similar than we think now. Aren't we forgetting something? Beth said. Where is everybody? If people flew this thing in either time or space, where are they? Probably somewhere else in the ship. I'm not so sure, Harry said. Look at the leather on these seats. It's brand new. Maybe it was a new ship? No, I mean brand new. This leather doesn't show any scratches, any cuts, any coffee cup spills or stains. There's nothing to suggest that these seats have ever been sat in. Maybe there wasn't any crew. Why would you have seats if there isn't any crew? Maybe they took the crew out at the last minute. It seems they were worried about radiation. The inner hull's lead shielded too. Why should there be radiation associated with time travel? I know, Ted said. Maybe the ship got launched by accident. Maybe the ship was on the launch pad and somebody pressed the button before the crew got aboard, so the ship took off empty. You mean, oops, wrong button? That'd be a hell of a mistake, Norman said. Barnes shook his head. I'm not buying it. For one thing, a ship this big could never be launched from Earth. It had to be built and assembled in orbit and launched from space. What do you make of this? Bev said, pointing to another console near the rear of the flight deck. There was a fourth chair, drawn up close to the console. The leather was wrapped around a human form. No kidding. There's a man in there? Let's have a look. Beth pushed the armrest buttons. The chair whirred back from the console and unwrapped itself. They saw a man, staring forward, his eyes open. My God. After all these years, perfectly preserved, Ted said. You would expect that, Harry said, considering he's a mannequin. But he's so lifelike. Give our descendants some credit for advances, Harry said. They're half a century ahead of us. He pushed the mannequin forward, exposing an umbilicus running out the back at the base of the hips. Wires. Not wires, Ted said. Glass. Optical cables. This whole ship uses optical technology and not electronics. In any case, it's one mystery solved, Harry said, looking at the dummy. Obviously, this craft was built to be a manned ship, but it was sent out unmanned. Why? Probably because the intended voyage was too dangerous. They sent an unmanned vessel first, before they sent a manned vessel. Beth said, And where did they send it? With time travel, you don't send it to where, you send it to when. Okay, then to when did they send it? Harry shrugged. No information yet, he said. That diffidence again, Norman thought. What was Harry really thinking? Well, this craft is half a mile long, Barnes said. We'll have a lot more to see. I wonder if they had a flight recorder, Norman said. You mean like a commercial airliner? Yeah, something to record the activity of the ship on its voyage. They must have, Harry said. Trace the dummy cable back. You'll be sure to find it. I'd like to see that recorder too. In fact, I would say it's crucial. Norman was looking at the console, lifting up a keyboard panel. Look here, he said. I found a date. They clustered around. There was a stamp in the plastic beneath the keyboard. Intel Incorporated. Made in USA. Serial number 98004077. 8543. August 5th, 2043? Looks like it. So we're walking through a ship 50-odd years before it's going to be built? This is giving me a headache. Look here. Beth had moved forward from the console deck into what looked like living quarters. There were 20 bunk beds. Crew of 20? If it took 3 people to fly it, what were the other 17 for? Nobody had an answer to that. Next, they entered a large kitchen, a toilet, living quarters. Everything was new and sleekly designed, but recognizable for what it was. You know, Hal, this is a lot more comfortable than DH-8. Yeah, maybe we should move here. Absolutely not, Barnes said. We're studying this ship, not living in it. We've got a lot more work to do before we begin to know what this is all about. It'd be more efficient to live here while we explore it. I don't want to live here, Harry said. Gives me the creeps. Me too, Beth said. They had been aboard the ship for an hour now, and Norman's feet hurt. That was another thing that he hadn't anticipated. While exploring a large spacecraft in the future, your feet could begin to hurt. But Barnes continued on. Leaving the crew quarters, they entered a vast area of narrow walkways set out between great sealed compartments that stretched ahead as far as they could see. The compartments turned out to be storage bays of immense size. They opened one bay and found it was filled with heavy plastic containers, which looked rather like the loading containers of contemporary airliners, except many times larger. They opened one container. No kidding, Barnes said, peering inside. What is it? Food. The food was wrapped in layers of lead foil and plastic, like NASA rations. Ted picked one up. Food from the future, he said, and smacked his lips. You're going to eat that? Absolutely, Ted said. You know, I once had a bottle of Dom Perignon from 1897, but this will be the first time I've ever had anything to eat from the future, from 243. It's also 300 years old, Harry said. Maybe you want to film this? Ted said to Edmonds. Me eating? Edmonds dutifully put the camera to her eye. flicked on the light. "Let's not do that now," Barnes said. "We have other things to accomplish." "This is human interest," Ted said. "Not now," Barnes said firmly. He opened a second storage container and a third. They all contained food. They moved to the next storage bay and opened up more containers. "It's all food. Nothing but food." The ship had traveled with an enormous amount of food. Even allowing for a crew of 20, it was enough food for a voyage of several years. They were getting very tired. It was a relief when Beth found a button. Said, "I wonder what this does." Barnes said, "Beth," and the walkway began to move, rubber tread rolling forward with a slight hum. "Beth, I want you to stop pushing every damn button you see." But nobody else objected. It was a relief to ride the walkway past dozens of identical storage bays. Finally, they came to a new section, much farther forward. Norman guessed by now that they were a quarter of a mile from the crew compartments in the back. That meant they were roughly in the middle of the huge ship. And here, they found a room with life support equipment and 20 hanging spacesuits. "Bingo," Ted said. "It's finally clear. This ship is intended to travel to the stars." The others murmured, excited by the possibility. Suddenly it all made sense. The great size, the vastness of space, the complexity of the control consoles. "Oh, for Christ's sake," Harry said. "It can't have been made to travel to stars. This is obviously a conventional spacecraft, although very large. And at conventional speeds, the nearest star is 250 years away. Maybe they had new technology. Where is it? There's no evidence of new technology." "Well, maybe it's—" "Face the facts, Ted," Harry said. "Even with this huge size, the ship is only provisioned for a few years. 15 or 20 at most. How far could it go in that time? Barely out of the solar system, right?" Ted nodded glumly. "It's true. It took the Voyager spacecraft 5 years to reach Jupiter, 9 years to reach Uranus. In 15 years? Maybe they were going to Pluto. Why would anyone want to go to Pluto?" "We don't know yet, but—" The radio squawked. The voice of Tina Chan said, "Captain Barnes, Service wants you for a secure encrypted communication, sir." "Okay," Barnes said. "It's time to go back anyway." They headed back, through the vast ship, to the main entrance.
Space and time.
They were sitting in the lounge of DH-8, watching the divers working on the grid. Barnes was in the next cylinder talking to the surface. Levy was cooking lunch, or dinner. A meal, anyway. They were all getting confused about what the Navy people called surface time. "Surface time doesn't matter down here," Edmund said, in her precise librarian's voice. "Day or night, it just doesn't make a difference. You get used to it." They nodded vaguely. Everyone was tired, Norman saw. The strain, the tension of the exploration had taken its toll. Beth had already drifted off to sleep, feet up on the coffee table, her muscular arms folded across her chest. Outside the window, 3 small submarines had come down and were hovering over the grid. Several divers were clustered around. Others were headed back to the divers' habitat, DH-7. "Looks like something's up," Harry said. "Something to do with Barnes' call?" "Could be." Harry was still preoccupied, distracted. "Where's Tina Chan?" "She must be with Barnes. Why?" "I need to talk to her." "What about?" Ted said. "It's personal," Harry said. Ted raised his eyebrows but said nothing more. Harry left, going into D cylinder. Norman and Ted were alone. "He's a strange fellow," Ted said. "Is he?" "You know he is, Norman. Arrogant, too. Probably because he's black. Compensating, don't you think?" "I don't know." "I'd say he has a chip on his shoulder," Ted said. "He seems to resent everything about this expedition." He sighed. "Of course, mathematicians are all strange. He's probably got no sort of life at all. I mean a private life, women and so forth. Did I tell you I got married again?" "I read it somewhere," Norman said. "She's a television reporter," Ted said. "Wonderful woman." He smiled. "When we got married, she gave me this Corvette. Beautiful 58 Corvette as a wedding present. You know that nice fire engine red color they had in the 50s? That color. Ted paced around the room, glanced over at Beth. I just think this is all unbelievably exciting. I couldn't possibly sleep. Norman nodded. It was interesting how different they all were, he thought. Ted, eternally optimistic, with the bubbling enthusiasm of a child. Harry, with the cold, critical demeanor, the icy mind, the unblinking eye. Beth, not so intellectual, or so Beth, not so intellectual, or Beth, not so intellectual or cerebral. At once more physical and more emotional. That was why, though they were all exhausted, only Beth could sleep. Say, Norman, Ted said, I thought you said this was going to be scary. I thought it would be, Norman said. Well, Ted said, of all the people who could be wrong about this expedition, I'm glad it was you. I am too. Although I can't imagine why you would select a man like Harry Adams for this team. Not that he isn't distinguished, but Norman didn't want to talk about Harry. Ted, remember back on the ship when you said space and time are aspects of the same thing? Space-time, yes. I never really understood that. Why? It's quite straightforward. You can explain it to me? Sure. In English, Norman said. You mean explain it without mathematics? Yes. Well, I'll try. Ted frowned, but Norman knew he was pleased. Ted loved to lecture. He paused for a moment, then said, Okay, let's see where we need to begin. You're familiar with the idea that gravity is just geometry? No. Curvature of space and time? Not really, no. Einstein's general relativity? Einstein's general relativity? Sorry, Norman said. Never mind, Ted said. There was a bowl of fruit on the table. Ted emptied the bowl, setting the fruit on the table. Okay, this is space. Nice, flat space. Okay, Norman said. Ted began to position the pieces of fruit. This orange is the sun, and these are the planets which move in circles around the sun. So we have the whole solar system on this table. Okay? Fine, Ted said. Now, the sun, he pointed to the orange in the center of the table, is very large, so it has a lot of gravity. Right? Ted gave Norman a ball bearing. This is a spaceship. I want you to send it through the solar system so it passes very close to the sun. Okay. Okay. Norman took the ball bearing and rolled it so it passed close to the orange. Okay. You notice that your ball bearing rolled straight across the flat table. Right. But in real life, what would happen to your spacecraft when it passed near the sun? It would get sucked into the sun. Yes. We say it would fall into the sun. The spacecraft could curve inward from a straight line and hit the sun. But your spacecraft didn't. No. So we know that the flat table is wrong, Ted said. Real space can't be flat like the table. It can't? No, Ted said. He took the empty bowl and set the orange in the bottom. Now, roll your ball straight across past the sun. Norman flicked the ball bearing into the bowl. The ball curved and spiraled down the inside of the bowl until it hit the orange. Okay, Ted said. The spacecraft hit the sun just like it would in real life. But if I gave it enough speed, Norman said, it'd go right past it. It'd roll down and up the far side of the bowl and out again. Correct, Ted said. Also like real life. If the spacecraft has enough velocity, it will escape the gravitational field of the sun. Right. So, Ted said, what we are showing is that a spacecraft passing the sun in real life behaves as if it were entering a curved region of space around the sun. Space around the sun is curved like this bowl. Okay. And if your ball had the right speed, it wouldn't escape from the bowl, but instead would just spiral around endlessly inside the rim of the bowl. And that's what the planets are doing. They're endlessly spiraling inside the bowl created by the sun. He put the orange back on the table. In reality, you should imagine that the table is made out of rubber, and the planets are all making dents in the rubber as they sit there. That's what space is really like. Real space is curved, and the curvature changes with the amount of gravity. Yes? So, Ted said, space is curved by gravity. Okay. And that means you can think of gravity as nothing more than the curvature of space. The Earth has The Earth has gravity because the Earth curves the space around it. Okay, except it's not that simple, Ted said. Norman sighed. I didn't think it would be. Harry came back into the room, looked at the fruit on the table, but said nothing. Now, when you roll your ball bearing across the table, you'll notice that it not only spirals down, but it also goes faster, right? Yes. Now, when an object goes faster, time on that object passes slower. Einstein proved that early in the century. What it means is that you can also think of the curvature of space as also representing a curvature of time. The deeper the curve in the bowl, the slower time passes. Harry said, Well, layman's terms. Ted said, Give the guy a break. Yeah, Norman said, Give the guy a break. Ted held up the bowl. Now, if you're doing all this mathematically, what you find is that the curved bowl is neither space nor time, but the combination of both, which is called space-time. This bowl is space-time, and objects moving on it are moving in space-time. We don't think about movement that way, but that's what really is happening. It is? Sure. Take baseball. Idiot game, Harry said. I hate games. You know baseball, Ted said to Norman. Yes, Norman said. Okay, imagine the batter hits a line drive to the center fielder. The ball goes almost straight out and it takes, say, half a second. Right. Now imagine the batter hits a high pop fly to the same center fielder. This time the ball goes way up in the air and it takes 6 seconds before the center fielder catches it. Okay. Now, the paths of the two balls, the line drive and the pop fly, look very different to us. But both these balls move exactly the same in space-time. No, Norman said. Yes, Ted said. In a way you already know it. Suppose I asked you to hit a high pop fly to the center fielder, but to make it reach the fielder in half a second instead of 6 seconds. Well, that's impossible, Norman said. Why? Just hit the pop fly harder. If I hit it harder, it'll go higher up and end up taking longer. Okay. Then I want you to hit a low line drive that takes 6 seconds to reach center field. Well, I can't do that either. Right, Ted said. So what you're telling me is that you can't make the ball do anything you want. There's a fixed relationship between governing the path of the ball through space and time. Sure, because the Earth has gravity. Yes, Ted said. And we've already agreed that gravity is a curvature of space-time, like the curve of this bowl. Any baseball on Earth must move along the same curve as space-time, as this ball bearing moves across the bowl. Look. He put the orange back in the bowl. Here's the Earth. He put 2 fingers on the opposite sides of the orange. Here's batter and field. Now, roll the ball bearing from one finger to the other, and you'll find you'll have to accommodate the curve of the bowl. Either you flick the ball lightly and it will roll close to the orange, or you can give it a big flick and it will go way up the side of the bowl before falling down to the other side. But you can't make this ball bearing do anything you want, because the ball bearing is moving along the curved bowl. And that's what your baseball is really doing. It's moving on curved space-time. Norman said, I sort of get it, but what does this have to do with time travel? Well, we think the gravitational field of the Earth is strong. It hurts us when we fall down, but in reality it's very weak. It's almost non-existent. So space-time around the Earth isn't very curved. Space-time is much more curved around the Sun. And in other parts of the universe, it's very curved, producing a sort of roller coaster ride, and all sorts of distortions of time may occur. In fact, if you consider a black hole... He broke off. Yes, Ted? A black hole? Oh my God, Ted said softly. Harry pushed his glasses up on his nose and said, Ted, for once in your life, you just might be right. They both grabbed for paper, began scribbling. It couldn't be a Schwarzschild. It couldn't be a Schwarzschild hold. No, it had to be rotating. Angular momentum would assure that. And you couldn't approach the singularity. No, the tidal forces rip you apart. But if you just dip below the event horizon, is it possible? Did they have the nerve? The two fell silent, making calculations, muttering to themselves. What is it about a black hole? Norman said, but they weren't listening to him anymore. The intercom clicked. Barnes said, Attention, this is the captain speaking. I want all hands in the conference room on the double. We're in the conference room, Norman said. On the double, now. We're already there, Hal. That's all. Barnes said, and the intercom clicked off.